It is early 1945. American troops are finally pushing into Germany, but ahead of them sits a heavily fortified town. The defenders refuse to surrender, firing back with everything they have. The American infantry tighten their grip on their rifles. They are preparing for the worst kind of hell, house-to-house urban combat. But just as they are about to kick in the first door, an order comes down from the top. Pull them back. And then a second order is given. Destroy everything. What followed was not a battle. It was calculated destruction. By early 1945, the European theater of World War II had fundamentally shifted. The Third Reich was bleeding out. But a dying beast is often the most dangerous. Following the devastating failure of the Battle of the Bulge, the German army knew they could no longer win in an open battlefield. They lacked the armor, they lacked the fuel, and they lacked the men. So, they changed the rules of the game. They moved the war into the streets. Across the Western Front, quaint German towns and centuries-old villages were quietly transformed into sophisticated death traps. They were designated as Festungen, fortresses. Every cobblestone street was meticulously pre-sighted for mortar fire. Every stone cellar was reinforced with concrete and sandbags. Every church steeple became a sniper's nest. For an attacking army, urban combat is the ultimate nightmare. It strips away the advantages of mobility. It forces soldiers to fight in a chaotic, three-dimensional maze. Danger doesn't just come from the front, it comes from above, from below, from the shadows of a ruined wall. In a destroyed city, a squad of desperate German conscripts, armed with anti-tank rockets and machine guns, could hold off an entire American battalion. Taking a single street could cost rivers of blood. Clearing one apartment block could take a full day of brutal, close-quarters combat. It was a meat grinder, and the German High Command wanted to drag the advancing Americans right into the teeth of it. They hoped to make the Allied advance so painfully slow and so incredibly costly that it would break their morale. But the American military had a completely different philosophy. By 1945, the United States Army was the most mechanized, heavily armed force on the planet. And their combat doctrine was rooted in one unwavering principle: preserve the fighting man. American commanders were trained to never send an infantryman to do a job that a high-explosive shell could do. Metal is cheap. Flesh is expensive. Artillery rounds can be replaced. American boys cannot. The doctrine dictated that the infantry's job was simply to find the enemy. The heavy firepower's job was to annihilate them. As General George S. Patton's forces pushed deeper into the German homeland, this doctrine was about to face its ultimate test. They were approaching a web of these fortified towns. The Germans were waiting in the dark. Their weapons were loaded. Their ambushes were set. They expected the Americans to play by the old rules. They expected them to bleed for every inch of ground. The lead elements of the American armored columns rolled into the outskirts of the town. It was eerily quiet. No civilians, no movement, just the low, heavy rumble of tank engines echoing off the ancient stone walls. In the open fields of Europe, the American M4 Sherman tank was a dominant force. But in these narrow, winding cobblestone streets, it was completely blind. It was prey. The streets were too tight to easily traverse. The gun barrels could barely turn without hitting a building. American infantrymen hugged the brick walls, stepping carefully alongside the armor. Their eyes frantically scanned the dark, empty windows above them. Every shadow looked like a sniper. Every pile of rubble looked like a machine gun nest. For a brief moment, they thought they had caught the defenders sleeping. They were wrong. The Germans were simply waiting for them to walk into the center of the kill zone. It started with a single, sharp crack of a rifle. And then, the entire street exploded. An MG-42 machine gun, known to the Americans as Hitler's buzzsaw, opened up from a reinforced basement window. Firing at a terrifying rate of over 1,000 rounds a minute, it pinned an entire platoon to the pavement in seconds. Before the tanks could even locate the source of the fire, the trap snapped shut. From a second-story bedroom, a blinding flash illuminated the narrow street. A Panzerfaust anti-tank rocket streaked down from above. It slammed directly into the lead Sherman tank. Metal shrieked. Flames erupted. Black smoke instantly choked the alleyway, blinding the rest of the column. The advance was completely blocked. Suddenly, fire was pouring in from all three dimensions. This was no longer a traditional front line. It was a 360-degree nightmare. Rifle fire rained down from the rooftops. Grenades were casually tossed from high windows, bouncing off the cobblestones, before detonating right in the middle of the pinned-down troops. The American infantry tried to react. They tried to push forward, kick in doors, and clear the lower floors. But the buildings were rigged for slaughter. Staircases were booby-trapped with tripwires. Holes had been knocked through the interior walls of the apartments, allowing the German defenders to shoot, fall back to the next room, and shoot again without ever stepping outside. The casualties began to mount with terrifying speed. Cries for medics echoed down the alleyways, but anyone who stepped out from cover was instantly cut down by crossfire. The American advance didn't just slow down. It ground to a violent, bloody halt. Back at the command post, the radio operators listened to the chaos. The chatter painted a grim, desperate picture. Company commanders were screaming for support, reporting that they were taking devastating losses just to cross a single street. The high command looked at the maps. The reality of the situation set in. This was not a simple delay tactic. This was a meat grinder. A calculated, perfectly engineered meat grinder designed to trade cheap German concrete for expensive American blood. If they kept fighting house by house, room by room, they would lose hundreds of men before they even reached the town square. They needed a different answer. The frantic radio transmissions finally reached the rear. They echoed through the tactical command post of the United States Third Army. General George S. Patton stood silently over a sprawling map board. He listened to the casualty reports ticking upward. Men bleeding out in dark basements, armor burning in narrow alleys, a grinding, agonizing stalemate. For Patton, momentum was a religion. Speed was life. A static army was a dying army. And right now, his men were bleeding out in a concrete bottleneck. Commanders of lesser resolve might have doubled down. They might have told the panicked officers on the ground to push harder. They might have ordered the infantry to fix bayonets, clear the rubble, and take the town room by agonizing room. It was the traditional way to fight. It was the expected way to fight. But Patton possessed a brutal, uncompromising clarity. He stared down at the map coordinates. He didn't see a town that needed capturing. He saw a trap, a psychological and tactical snare. The German defenders wanted to pull the Americans into a knife fight in the dark. They wanted to strip away the massive Allied advantage in artillery and air power. They wanted to turn American boys into bullet sponges. Patton absolutely refused to play their game. He understood the dark calculus of modern war. Every hour spent clearing a single street meant dozens of men dead. Every door kicked in was a roll of the dice with a soldier's life. He was not going to trade his elite infantrymen for a few blocks of German real estate. This wasn't an honorable duel. This was an execution block. And Patton was not going to let his men be the ones on the chopping block. He made a decision that perfectly encapsulated the terrifying efficiency of the American war machine. He would completely rewrite the rules of engagement. There would be no ceasefire. There would be no negotiations with the garrison. And there would be absolutely no more house-to-house fighting. He turned to his staff officers. The orders he gave were chilling in their absolute simplicity. He wasn't going to send more flesh into the meat grinder. He was going to obliterate the grinder itself. The message sent down the chain of command was clear. They were not going to take the town. They were going to erase it. The radios crackled back to life on the front lines. The frantic company commanders huddled in the rubble, expecting orders to mount a desperate counterattack. Instead, the command came through, crisp and clean. "Pull them back." The American infantry, battered and bleeding, began to systematically disengage. They laid down heavy suppression fire, grabbed their wounded, and dragged themselves out of the kill zones. They abandoned the ground they had just fought so desperately to hold. For a brief moment, the German defenders thought they had won. They thought they had broken the American spirit. They watched from their shattered windows as the infantry pulled back behind the tree line. But they had not won a victory. They had merely been given a front-row seat to their own execution. A profound, unnatural silence fell over the town. It lasted for exactly 15 minutes. And then the sky tore open. Miles away, hidden behind the American lines, entire batteries of 155mm howitzers roared to life. This was not a warning shot. This was not a precision strike on military targets. This was a time-on-target barrage, a synchronized, overwhelming application of supreme violence. The air was instantly filled with the terrifying scream of heavy steel falling from the clouds. When the first shells hit, the earth simply ceased to exist. The entire town erupted in a series of earth-shattering concussions. The 155mm high explosive rounds didn't just penetrate rooftops, they vaporized them. Ancient stone structures that had stood for 300 years were reduced to dust in milliseconds. The sky turned black with pulverized brick and ash. But Patton wasn't finished. He didn't just want to bombard the town. He wanted to systematically deconstruct it. As the artillery barrage pounded the center of the town, the American armor rolled forward once more. But this time, they didn't push down the narrow streets. They lined up on the high ground outside the city limits. The Sherman tanks and heavily armored tank destroyers elevated their massive 75 and 90mm main guns. They targeted the strongpoints from a safe distance. They didn't aim for windows or doorways. They fired directly into the foundations of the buildings. Point-blank high explosives slammed into the load-bearing walls of the German sniper nests. Entire apartment blocks shuddered, groaned, and collapsed in on themselves, burying the defenders alive in avalanches of stone and timber. Then came the roar of engines from above. A flight of P-47 Thunderbolts, heavily armed with 500-pound bombs and rockets, dove out of the sun. They practically skimmed the rooftops, unleashing a torrent of destruction that left entire city blocks engulfed in massive fireballs. This was not anger. This was not revenge. This was cold, calculated, mechanical destruction. The American war machine was applying overwhelming, disproportionate force to solve a tactical problem. They did not clear the town house by house. They cleared it grid square by grid square. The barrage lasted for hours. The noise was so deafening that the American infantrymen watching from a mile away had to cover their ears. They watched as a town that had been an impenetrable fortress that morning was slowly, methodically flattened into a smoking graveyard of rubble. When the dust finally began to settle, the landscape was unrecognizable. The fortified town was gone. It had been violently deleted from the map. Where there were once multi-story apartment buildings, there were now only smoking craters. Where there were once carefully prepared machine gun nests, there were only shattered bricks and twisted metal. The German defenders who survived the initial onslaught found themselves in a waking nightmare. Their carefully planned kill zones were buried, their communication lines were severed, and their morale was completely shattered. The psychological impact of such overwhelming, inescapable firepower was devastating. They had prepared to fight men. They had prepared for a bloody, intimate struggle in the darkness of the city streets. But they had no defense against an enemy that simply erased the very ground they stood on. Slowly, figures began to emerge from the choking dust. Covered in gray ash, bleeding from their ears, the surviving German soldiers staggered out of the basements that had become their tombs. They did not raise their weapons. They raised their hands in the air. They surrendered to an enemy they had barely even seen. For the American infantrymen watching from the edge of the destruction, the relief was palpable. The suffocating dread of having to re-enter that death trap evaporated. They would not have to kick down any more doors. They would not have to throw grenades blindly into dark stairwells. They would not have to watch their brothers die slowly on cold cobblestones. The meat grinder had been broken. General Patton's ruthless decision had achieved its exact objective. The town was neutralized. The enemy was eliminated or captured.
The road ahead was open. But most importantly, the advance continued with minimal loss of American lives. He had saved his men from the slaughter, but he had done so at a terrifying cost to the landscape of the enemy. This single, brutal event perfectly illustrated the brutal calculus of modern total war. It forces us to look beyond the simplistic ideas of right and wrong and confront the darkest realities of military command. It demands that we ask a profoundly difficult question. In the aftermath of the bombardment, the moral implications of Patton's decision hung heavy in the smoke-filled air. We look back at World War II through a lens of heroism and clear-cut victories. But on the ground, in the dirt and the blood, commanders faced choices where there were no good options, only less terrible ones. The traditional military doctrine demanded a house-to-house assault. It was the accepted way to clear a fortified town. But if Patton had ordered his men back into those streets, the cost would have been horrific. Hundreds of American soldiers would have died violently. They would have bled to death in cold basements. They would have been burned alive in their tanks. They would have been sacrificed simply to follow a conventional playbook. By choosing the alternative, Patton saved an incalculable number of his own men. He looked at the battlefield and made a calculated trade. He traded the existence of a German town for the lives of American boys. But the alternative was annihilation. The complete, indiscriminate destruction of civilian infrastructure, the leveling of history, the deployment of an overwhelming, terrifying amount of high-explosive ordnance against a populated area. It was a stark, brutal display of the American way of war: firepower over manpower, metal over flesh. When you stand in the shoes of a commander, the math is horrifyingly simple. Your primary objective is to destroy the enemy. Your secondary objective is to bring your men home. And sometimes, achieving both requires actions that look monstrous to the outside world. If you are a soldier pinned down in an alley, Patton is your savior. If you are the civilian whose home was just vaporized, he is a destroyer. So, what is the right answer in the crucible of total war? Is it more humane to feed your own men into a meat grinder simply to preserve the buildings they fight in? Or is it more humane to erase a city from the map if it means your soldiers live to see another dawn? It is a terrifying paradox, the kind of paradox that defines the true nature of conflict. And it leaves us with one final, haunting question. The ashes of that unnamed German town have long since blown away. The craters have been filled. The streets have been paved. The buildings have been rebuilt. But the echo of that artillery barrage still lingers in the history of modern warfare. It stands as a chilling reminder of what total war actually demands. It strips away the romance of combat and leaves only the brutal, mechanical truth of survival. To the infantrymen of the United States Third Army, General George S. Patton wasn't a monster. He was the reason they survived the meat grinder. He was the reason they didn't bleed out on a foreign cobblestone street. He was the reason they actually got to go home. But history judges from a distance. It looks at the flattened cities, the obliterated history, the overwhelming, terrifying use of absolute force. And it asks us to carefully weigh the true cost of victory. War is not just about who is right, it is about who is left. So, as you look back at the smoke clearing over the ruins of 1945, was Patton ruthless? Or was he the only one willing to do what it took to save his men?